Iwo Jima, February 1945. Japanese artillery pounds the black volcanic sand. Marines crouch behind whatever cover they can find: rocks, destroyed landing craft, the bodies of the fallen. Radio communications are chaos. Officers shouting coordinates, medics calling for evacuations, forward observers directing naval gunfire. And somewhere in that hell, a young Navajo Marine speaks into a field radio in a language that shouldn't exist in war, the language his grandfather spoke, the language government schools tried to beat out of him as a child, the language that will help win this battle and this war. Within minutes of his transmission, American artillery rains precisely on Japanese positions. No delay for encryption, no risk of interception. The Japanese, who've broken every American code thrown at them, hear only incomprehensible sounds they can't decode, can't translate, can't stop. This is the story of approximately 420 Navajo Marines who created the only unbroken code in modern military history. Men who grew up on reservations where speaking their native language meant punishment, who attended government boarding schools designed to erase their culture, who weren't even considered United States citizens until 1924. Yet, when America needed an unbreakable code, they turned to the very language the government had spent decades trying to destroy. The Navajo code talkers transmitted thousands of messages during World War II's Pacific Campaign at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Not a single message was decoded by the enemy. This is their story not just of military innovation, but of identity reclaimed, of culture weaponized in the most unexpected way, of young men who saved American lives, while carrying the weight of generations who'd been told their language had no value. This is the Code Talkers' War. To understand what the Code Talkers accomplished, you need to understand what they carried into war, not just language, but an entire worldview shaped by land, tradition, and survival. The Navajo Nation Diné Bikaya, in their language, meaning the people's land, spans 27,000 square miles across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. It's a landscape of stark beauty and harder reality: red rock mesas, high desert plains, winter snows, and summer heat that tests human endurance. The land shapes the people who live on it. The Diné, the people, as they call themselves, had inhabited this region for centuries when the United States expanded westward in the 1840s and 50s. The collision between Navajo culture and American expansion was brutal and prolonged. In 1864, the U.S. Army, led by Kit Carson, conducted a scorched earth campaign against the Navajo, burning crops, destroying homes, killing livestock, forcing surrender through starvation. Approximately 9,000 Navajo were force-marched over 300 miles to Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico, a journey called the Long Walk, where hundreds died. At Bosque Redondo, conditions were catastrophic. Different tribes forced together, inadequate food, disease spreading rapidly, the land unable to support the population imprisoned there. The attempt to turn Navajo into farmers on unsuitable land was failing spectacularly. In 1868, after 4 years of suffering, the United States admitted the policy's failure. A treaty allowed the Navajo to return to a portion of their traditional lands, establishing the Navajo Reservation. The return journey was joyful but traumatic, back to a homeland devastated by war, where rebuilding would take generations. This history shaped every Navajo who would become a code talker. The Long Walk wasn't ancient history, it was grandparents' lived experience, stories told around fires, wounds not yet healed. But the trauma didn't end with the return home. The United States government, believing Native American cultures were obstacles to civilization, implemented policies designed to erase indigenous identities. The primary weapon was education. But in the 1920s and 30s, that irony was still years away. Navajo youth navigated a world that demanded they reject their identity while constantly reminding them they'd never be fully American. When World War II began in 1941, the Navajo relationship with the United States was complicated, layered with trauma, resilience, and an ongoing struggle for recognition and rights. The citizenship granted in 1924 was recent enough that many code talkers' parents hadn't been considered citizens when they were born. Yet, when war came, Navajo men volunteered in numbers disproportionate to their population. Not because the United States had treated them well, it hadn't, but because the Navajo concept of duty, protection of community, and warrior tradition ran deeper than the nation-state that had tried to erase them. They would go to war for a country that didn't fully accept them, speaking a language that country had tried to destroy, and in doing so would save thousands of American lives. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the U.S. government established a system of Indian boarding schools, based on a philosophy articulated by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the K1ll Indian Industrial School. Kill the Indian, save the man. The theory was brutal in its simplicity. Remove native children from their families and communities. Strip away their culture, language, and traditions. Replace these with American values and English language. Transform indigenous children into productive members of white American society. Navajo children, some as young as 5 or 6, were taken from their families sometimes by force when parents resisted and sent to boarding schools. The experience was systematically traumatic. Upon arrival, children's hair was cut short, significant in Navajo culture, where long hair represented strength and identity. They were given American names, their Navajo names forbidden. Traditional clothing was confiscated, replaced with uniforms. They were punished often physically for speaking Navajo, even to siblings. The punishment for speaking one's native language varied by institution, but was universally harsh. Mouths washed with lye soap, beatings with rulers or belts, solitary confinement, public humiliation. Children learned quickly. Speaking Navajo brought pain. English brought survival. Samuel Billison, who would become a code talker, later recalled his boarding school experience. We were taught that our language was worthless, that our culture was primitive, that being Navajo was something to be ashamed of. They wanted us to forget we were Diné. End quote. The psychological impact was profound. Generations of Navajo children grew up disconnected from their language and culture, yet never fully accepted by white society. They existed in a painful liminal space, not Indian enough for their communities, not American enough for the broader society. But language is resilient when rooted in community. Despite boarding school policies, Navajo survived. Grandparents who'd never attended school continued speaking it. Parents whispered it at home. Children, forbidden to speak it at school, would speak it during summers on the reservation. The language persisted, wounded but alive. This persistence was unintentional resistance. The same government trying to erase Navajo language would, decades later, desperately need it. The irony is almost too heavy. Young men who'd been punished for speaking Navajo in government schools would be recruited by that same government to speak Navajo in war. The language considered worthless would become one of America's most valuable military assets. But in the 1920s and 30s, that irony was still years away. Navajo youth navigated a world that demanded they reject their identity while constantly reminding them they'd never be fully American. When World War II began in 1941, the Navajo relationship with the United States was complicated, layered with trauma, resilience, and an ongoing struggle for recognition and rights. The citizenship granted in 1924 was recent enough that many code talkers' parents hadn't been considered citizens when they were born. Yet when war came, Navajo men volunteered in numbers disproportionate to their population. Not because the United States had treated them well, it hadn't, but because the Navajo concept of duty, protection of community, and warrior tradition ran deeper than the nation-state that had tried to erase them. They would go to war for a country that didn't fully accept them, speaking a language that country had tried to destroy, and in doing so would save thousands of American lives. February 1942. 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States was reeling from defeats across the Pacific. Philippines falling, Wake Island captured, Japanese forces seemingly unstoppable. And worse, Japanese intelligence was breaking American codes with terrifying efficiency. Every military communication system the United States used codes, ciphers, encryption machines was vulnerable. Messages sent in the morning were being read by Japanese intelligence by afternoon. American commanders couldn't communicate securely with their own forces. Men died because orders were intercepted, tactics anticipated, movements predicted. The military desperately needed a secure communication system. Encryption machines were too slow and too heavy for frontline combat. Traditional codes were being broken. What they needed was something Japanese cryptographers couldn't crack even if they intercepted it. Philip Johnston had an answer, though getting anyone to listen required persistence bordering on obsession. Johnston was the son of missionaries who'd worked on the Navajo reservation. He'd grown up there, playing with Navajo children, learning their language fluently, one of the few non-Navajo who could speak it. He'd left the reservation decades earlier, but the language stayed with him. After Pearl Harbor, Johnston read reports about Japanese code-breaking successes. Something clicked in his mind. Japanese intelligence could break codes, but they couldn't break a language they'd never encountered. What if military communications used Navajo as the basis for a code? The idea wasn't entirely new. During World War I, the U.S. Army had used Choctaw speakers to transmit tactical messages that Germans couldn't understand. But that had been improvised, limited, never developed into a formal system. Johnston envisioned something more sophisticated. He approached the Marine Corps at Camp Elliott near San Diego. His pitch was straightforward. Navajo language is unwritten, almost impossibly complex grammatically, known by virtually no one outside the Navajo Nation, and therefore perfect for military communications. Use Navajo speakers to transmit messages the enemy literally cannot comprehend. The initial reception was skeptical. Using a Native American language seemed like a novelty, not a serious military solution. What if Navajo speakers were captured? What if the language wasn't precise enough for military terminology? What about radio equipment failures or poor transmission conditions? Johnston persisted. He pointed out that Japan had sent anthropologists to study American Indian tribes before the war, but they'd focused on tribes near urban areas. The Navajo, living on a remote reservation in the southwest, had been largely overlooked. Japanese forces almost certainly had no Navajo speakers, no dictionaries, no linguistic resources to work with. The Marines agreed to a demonstration. In late February 1942, Johnston arranged for 4 Navajo men to demonstrate how the language could work for military communications. The demonstration was remarkable. The Navajo speakers could transmit and receive complex military messages in Navajo faster than existing encryption systems could process the same information in English. The Marines were convinced, but convincing leadership was only step 1. Now, they needed to build an actual code. The original 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Elliott in May 1942 for a mission that seemed impossible. Create a code based on Navajo language that could handle complex military terminology, be memorized completely. Nothing could be written down and potentially captured, and be fast enough for combat conditions. The recruits were young, late teens and early 20s and brought diverse backgrounds. Some had attended boarding schools and spoke English fluently. Others spoke primarily Navajo with limited English. What united them was fluency in Navajo and a willingness to do something unprecedented. The challenge was immediate and obvious. Navajo had no words for military equipment, tactics, or concepts. There was no Navajo word for tank, bomber, amphibious assault, or regimental command post. They would need to create these terms from scratch. The solution they devised was brilliant in its complexity. The code operated on 2 levels. Level 1. Direct substitution. For military terms with no Navajo equivalent, they created descriptive phrases using existing Navajo words. These phrases were poetic, grounded in Navajo culture and the natural world. Bomber became Jay-Sho, meaning buzzard. Battleship became Lotso, meaning whale. Submarine became Beshlo, meaning iron fish. Fighter plane became Da-He-Tai, high, meaning hummingbird. Tank became Che-Da-Gahi, meaning tortoise. The logic was culturally grounded. Bombers flew high like buzzards. Battleships were massive, like whales. Submarines moved underwater like iron fish. Each term made intuitive sense to Navajo speakers while being completely opaque to outsiders. Level 2. Phonetic alphabet. For spelling out words that didn't have code equivalents, place names, proper nouns, technical terms, they created a phonetic alphabet where Navajo words represented English letters. A became Wul-La-Chi, meaning ant. B became Shush, meaning bear. C became Moasi, meaning cat. D became B, meaning deer. This meant even if someone somehow understood the first level, they'd encounter a second layer, words spelled out letter by letter using Navajo animal and object names. The result was a code of extraordinary complexity. To decode a single message, you'd need to: first, understand Navajo fluently. Second, know the military code meanings for hundreds of Navajo words. Third, recognize when words were being used literally versus as code. Fourth, be able to decrypt the phonetic alphabet layer. The Japanese, who'd broken sophisticated encryption machines, faced an impossible challenge. They were trying to decode not just a code, but an entire language they'd never encountered, modified with layers of meaning only Navajo Marines knew. The original 29 recruits spent weeks developing, refining, and memorizing the code. Everything had to be committed to memory. If code books existed, they could be captured. Each code talker needed to hold hundreds of terms in his head, recall them instantly under combat stress, transmit and receive at speed. They practiced constantly, transmitting mock messages, handling increasing complexity, working under simulated stress conditions. The code needed to be fast. Communications delays in combat got people killed. Traditional encryption could take hours to encode and decode a message. The Navajo code could handle the same message in minutes. By August 1942, the system was operational. The Marine Corps ordered recruitment of additional Navajo speakers and began integrating code talkers into combat units deploying to the Pacific. The first test would come at Guadalcanal, where the Marines were about to begin their first major offensive operation of the Pacific War. The code talkers would either prove their worth under fire, or the experiment would fail spectacularly. The original 29 prepared for deployment, knowing they were carrying not just a code, but the reputation of their people, the vindication of a language they'd been punished for speaking, and the lives of Marines who would depend on their communications working under the worst possible conditions. They were about to go to war, speaking Navajo, the language boarding schools had tried to beat out of them, the language the government had declared worthless, the language that would help win the Pacific War. August 7th, 1942, the U.S. Marines launched their first major offensive of the Pacific War, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The operation was risky, under-resourced, and strategically vital. If successful, it would begin pushing back Japanese territorial gains. If it failed, the entire Pacific campaign might collapse. Among the Marines landing on Guadalcanal's beaches were several code talkers about to test whether their code would work under actual combat conditions or proved to be an interesting experiment that failed when it mattered most. The first hours were relatively unopposed. Japanese forces had been caught by surprise, but as Marines pushed inland toward their primary objective, a nearly completed Japanese airfield resistance intensified. Artillery, sniper fire, ambushes in the jungle. Communications became critical and chaotic. The code talkers went to work immediately, transmitting coordinates for artillery strikes, relaying troop movements, requesting supplies and reinforcements. Every message in Navajo, incomprehensible to Japanese radio intercepts. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Previous Pacific operations had seen devastating consequences from intercepted communications. Japanese forces ambushing troops because they'd heard orders being transmitted. Artillery strikes called off because Japanese intelligence knew they were coming. Supply convoys attacked because routes had been compromised. At Guadalcanal, this pattern broke. Japanese intelligence intercepted plenty of radio traffic. The code talkers weren't hiding their transmissions, just making them incomprehensible. But interception without comprehension was useless. The Japanese could hear Marines communicating, but had no idea what they were saying. One code talker, describing the early combat use later, said, "We'd transmit coordinates, call signs, tactical information, everything a commander needed. The Japanese could hear us clearly. But they couldn't understand a single word. For the first time, we could communicate openly without fear of compromise." The speed was equally revolutionary. Traditional code systems required multiple steps: write message in English, encode using codebook, time-consuming transmit encrypted message. The receiver decodes, using codebook, more time translate decoded message back to operational meaning. Total time, 30 minutes to several hours, depending on message complexity. The Navajo code required only 2 steps. Speak message in Navajo code, receiver understands immediately. Total time, seconds to minutes. In combat, where minutes could mean the difference between successful artillery support and friendly fire, this speed advantage saved lives directly and measurably. Marines who'd been skeptical about the code talkers, and there had been plenty of skepticism about whether Indians could handle combat stress, whether the code would work under pressure, whether this was just military experimentation, quickly became believers. Officers who'd resisted having code talkers assigned to their units began requesting them. The word spread through the Marine Corps. If you wanted secure, fast communications, you wanted code talkers. But Guadalcanal also revealed challenges nobody had anticipated. The jungle environment made radio transmission difficult. Vegetation absorbed signals. Weather caused interference. Terrain blocked line-of-sight communications. Code talkers adapted, sometimes climbing trees to get better transmission angles, using alternate frequencies, developing hand signals for when radios failed completely. More dangerously, many Marines couldn't distinguish between Navajo and Japanese when they heard it over radio static. Several code talkers reported being mistaken for Japanese infiltrators by their own forces, terrifying moments where fellow Marines almost shot them because they heard foreign language and assumed enemy presence. The solution was assigning bodyguards to code talkers, ostensibly for their protection from Japanese forces, but often equally important for protecting them from friendly fire incidents. The bodyguards learned to recognize Navajo speech patterns and could vouch for code talkers' identity when challenged. Guadalcanal became a 6-month campaign of brutal attrition. Marines fought disease, starvation, and desperate Japanese counterattacks. The code talkers transmitted thousands of messages, coordinating defenses, calling in naval gunfire, managing logistics for an operation that constantly teetered on the edge of failure. When Guadalcanal was finally secured in February 1943, Marine commanders recognized that the code talkers had been essential to the victory. What had started as an experimental program became standard procedure. Every Marine division deploying to the Pacific would include code talkers. The code had passed its test. Now it would be scaled up for the much larger operations ahead. February 19th, 1945. 3 years after Guadalcanal, the Pacific War had moved thousands of miles closer to Japan itself. The Marines were about to assault Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, strategically vital as an emergency landing site for bombers attacking Japan. The Japanese had spent months turning Iwo Jima into a fortress. 11 miles of tunnels, hundreds of artillery positions, machine gun nests covering every beach approach, over 20,000 troops, with orders to fight to the death. Intelligence predicted the island would be taken in 5 days. It took 36 days. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Over 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead. Almost every Japanese defender died. Only a few hundred survived to be captured. And throughout this hell, 6 code talkers worked around the clock, transmitting over 800 messages during the first 48 hours alone, all without error. Major Howard Connor, signals officer for the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima, would later state, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The intensity of Iwo Jima communications was unprecedented. Multiple divisions assaulting simultaneously. Naval gunfire coordination. Air support requests. Medical evacuations. Supply logistics. Command and control for tens of thousands of Marines in combat, all depending on radio communications that had to be secure, accurate, and fast. The code talkers worked in shifts but often exceeded them 18 to 20-hour days, transmitting in foxholes under artillery fire, with equipment damaged by volcanic ash and salt spray, maintaining concentration while the landscape around them exploded. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima offered almost no cover. Marines were exposed on beaches while Japanese artillery fired from elevated positions. The first wave suffered catastrophic casualties. Getting off the beach required precise coordination of supporting fire naval guns, aircraft, tanks, all directed through communications. Code talker messages guided this ballet of destruction. Naval gunfire on grid coordinates 2:24, 3:38, Japanese artillery position, danger close. Within minutes, shells from ships offshore would impact exactly where needed. No delay for encryption. No risk of Japanese forces hearing the call and repositioning. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, one of the most famous images in American history, represents a moment that required extensive coordination to achieve. The assault on Suribachi depended on communications transmitted by code talkers, directing supporting fire, coordinating troop movements, ensuring units didn't fire on each other in the confusion. One code talker described transmitting from a foxhole on Iwo Jima. Japanese mortars were falling constantly. You'd be talking on the radio, transmitting coordinates, and a shell would land close enough to shower you with volcanic sand. You had to keep talking, keep transmitting. Marines were depending on those coordinates being accurate. You couldn't stop because you were scared. The psychological pressure was immense. A mistake in coordinates could mean American artillery hitting American troops. Friendly fire incidents caused by communication errors were dreaded by everyone. Code talkers carried that responsibility every time they transmitted. Get it right, or people die. They got it right. Over and over, under impossible conditions, with fatigue and fear and chaos, they transmitted accurately and rapidly. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, remained completely baffled. They intercepted thousands of transmissions. They recorded them, analyzed them, brought in linguists to attempt translation. Nothing worked. One captured Japanese intelligence officer, interrogated after the war, described the frustration. "We collected your transmissions constantly. We analyzed the patterns, tried to find cribs known phrases that might reveal the code, looked for any opening. It was unlike any code we'd encountered. We couldn't even determine what language it was based on. Your system was impenetrable. The Japanese never broke the code. Not at Guadalcanal, not at Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, Guam, or any other battle where code talkers operated. Not even at Iwo Jima, where they had weeks to intercept and analyze thousands of transmissions. This achievement, an unbroken code throughout an entire war, is essentially unprecedented in modern military history. Every other major code system used in World War II was eventually broken to some degree. German Enigma, Japanese Purple Cipher, various Allied codes. The Navajo code remained secure because it wasn't just a code, it was a language modified with cultural knowledge that existed only in the minds of a few hundred Navajo Marines. By Iwo Jima, code talkers had become essential to Marine Corps operations. Their success had led to recruitment expansion from the original 29 to over 400 by war's end. They served in every Marine division in the Pacific, operated in every major battle, transmitted messages that coordinated operations involving hundreds of thousands of troops. Yet, they remained largely unknown outside the Marine Corps. The code was classified. Code talkers were forbidden from discussing their work. Their families often didn't know exactly what they did, just that they served as Marines in the Pacific. The recognition they deserved would be delayed for decades. Understanding what code talkers experienced in combat requires recognizing they carried burdens beyond those of typical Marines' burdens, rooted in identity, culture, and the specific nature of their role. First, the basic physical danger. Code talkers weren't rear echelon personnel. They operated on front lines, often in the most exposed positions because that's where commanders needed communications. They endured the same artillery, the same small arms fire, the same disease and hardship as every other Marine in the Pacific. Approximately 13 code talkers were killed in action, others were wounded. The mortality rate wasn't higher than average Marines, because they weren't specifically targeted. Japanese forces didn't know code talkers existed as a specific role, but it wasn't lower either. They bled and died like everyone else. But code talkers also carried psychological pressures unique to their position. They were utterly irreplaceable. A typical Marine rifleman, though valuable, was functionally interchangeable if wounded or killed. Another rifleman could take his position. Code talkers couldn't be replaced. If a code talker was killed, his entire communication network was compromised until another could be brought in. This knowledge that you personally were essential to your unit's survival created immense pressure. Some units assigned bodyguards to code talkers with explicit orders. Protect this Marine at all costs. The bodyguard's job was to keep the code talker alive, sometimes even at the cost of their own life. This created complex dynamics. Code talkers felt responsible for their bodyguard's safety. Bodyguards felt responsible for code talkers, and both understood that the code talker's survival was considered more operationally valuable. Second, the cognitive load was enormous. Code talkers had to maintain concentration under combat stress, while explosions and gunfire occurred around them, listen to English messages, and instantly translate them into Navajo code, receive Navajo code, and translate back to English. Maintain perfect accuracy. A single mistake in coordinates could kill. Fellow Marines do this for hours at a time, often in 18 to 20-hour shifts during major operations. Remember hundreds of code terms perfectly with no written reference. The mental exhaustion was severe. One code talker described it. After a long day of transmitting, your brain would feel numb. You'd be speaking Navajo code for hours, switching between English and Navajo constantly, maintaining perfect accuracy while terrified, and then you'd try to sleep with artillery still firing. Your mind couldn't rest. Third, the experience of being Navajo in a predominantly white military fighting a war against Asian enemies created specific tensions. Many Americans, including some Marines, had difficulty distinguishing between different Asian ethnicities. To some, anyone with Asian features was potentially enemy. Code talkers with Native American features were sometimes mistaken for Japanese infiltrators by their own forces. Several code talkers reported frightening incidents, being held at gunpoint by Marines who thought they were Japanese soldiers, being challenged aggressively, having to prove their identity multiple times. The assigned bodyguards helped, but the tension remained. Your own side sometimes saw you as potentially enemy because of how you looked. One code talker recalled, "We were fighting for America, transmitting messages that saved American lives, and sometimes we had to convince other Americans we weren't the enemy." That was its own kind of combat. The cultural distance worked both ways. Code talkers navigated multiple worlds simultaneously. Traditional Navajo culture, the boarding school experience that had tried to erase that culture, white American military culture, and combat culture. Each demanded different languages, behaviors, and identities. Navajo spiritual beliefs created additional complexity. Traditional Navajo culture had specific beliefs about death, violence, and the presence of death beliefs that couldn't easily coexist with combat environments where death was constant and unavoidable. Some code talkers experienced significant spiritual distress, knowing that traditional ceremonies would be needed after the war to restore spiritual balance, but unable to access those ceremonies while in combat. They were violating cultural prohibitions, constantly being present around death, participating in violence for a military mission. Yet many code talkers also drew strength from traditional warrior culture. Navajo history included warrior traditions, concepts of protecting one's people, honor through service. Some code talkers understood their service as continuing those traditions, recontextualizing traditional warrior values for modern warfare. The experience of speaking Navajo in combat after being punished for speaking it in boarding schools was powerfully validating for many. The same language teachers had hit them for using was now saving American lives. The culture the government had tried to erase was now proving its value in the most dramatic way possible. When the war ended in August 1945, code talkers faced new challenges, transitioning from combat to civilian life, returning to reservation communities that had been impacted differently by the war, and carrying secrets they couldn't share. The classification of the code created immediate problems. Code talkers were strictly forbidden from discussing their work, not with family, not with friends, not with other veterans. The code remained classified. It wouldn't be declassified until 1968, and military intelligence worried that revealing how it worked might provide useful information to potential future enemies. This meant code talkers returned home as generic veterans. Their families knew they'd served as Marines in the Pacific, but not specifically what they'd done. The pride they should have felt, the recognition they deserved, had to remain secret. Many struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, though in 1945 that term didn't exist. They'd experienced repeated trauma, witnessed horrific violence, lost friends in combat, and lived under extreme stress for months or years. Then, they were expected to simply readjust to normal life. Traditional Navajo culture had ceremonies for warriors returning from combat rituals designed to restore spiritual balance, remove the contamination of death, reintegrate warriors into peaceful community life. Some code talkers participated in these ceremonies. Enemy way rituals, blessing way, other traditional practices meant to heal the spiritual wounds of war. But these ceremonies assumed a kind of warfare that no longer existed. Traditional Navajo combat had been small-scale, personal, with different spiritual dimensions than industrial modern warfare. The ceremonies helped, but they weren't designed for the scale of trauma code talkers had experienced. Economic realities were harsh. Code talkers returned to a reservation where opportunities were limited, poverty was widespread, and their military service, which should have opened doors, often didn't. The GI Bill, which provided education and housing benefits to millions of white veterans, was less accessible to Native Americans due to bureaucratic barriers and discrimination. Some code talkers found work using skills from the military. Others struggled to find employment at all. The disconnect between their wartime importance, essential personnel, whose work saved thousands of lives, and their peacetime treatment, just another group of Native American veterans with limited prospects, was stark and painful. Many dealt with this through silence. They didn't discuss the war, didn't seek recognition, simply tried to move forward. This silence was partly cultural. Navajo culture values humility and discourages self-promotion, and partly necessity. What could they say? I saved American lives using my language when their language was still classified, when discussing it could result in prosecution. Families sometimes noticed changes. Code talkers, who'd been talkative before the war, became quiet. Those who'd struggled with identity before military service, caught between traditional Navajo culture and American assimilation pressure, sometimes returned even more conflicted. The war had complicated, rather than resolved, their relationship with American identity. The decades after the war saw code talkers aging, raising families, living relatively ordinary lives on the reservation or in border towns, carrying extraordinary secrets that nobody knew about. They watched war movies that got Pacific combat wrong, heard people discuss World War II cryptography without mentioning the unbroken code, saw Navajo culture still marginalized while knowing it had contributed decisively to Allied victory. Recognition, when it finally came, would take decades and require advocacy from unexpected sources. In 1968, 23 years after the war ended, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. Code talkers could, for the first time, publicly discuss what they'd done during the war. But declassification didn't automatically bring recognition. The general public remained largely unaware of the code talkers' role. Military historians knew about them, but popular understanding of World War II focused on European theatre, D-Day, famous generals, major battles. The Pacific War received less attention, and specific innovations like the Navajo Code even less. Through the 1970s and 80s, awareness grew slowly. Some code talkers began speaking publicly about their experiences at schools, veterans' events, tribal gatherings. Journalists occasionally wrote articles. Academics studying Native American history included code talkers in broader narratives about indigenous peoples' complex relationships with the United States government. But comprehensive recognition required advocacy. Navajo tribal leaders, supported by sympathetic members of Congress, began pushing for official acknowledgement of what code talkers had accomplished. The argument was straightforward. These men had contributed decisively to American victory using a language and culture the government had previously tried to destroy. That irony deserved formal recognition. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed August 14th as National Code Talkers Day, providing some recognition but stopping short of official congressional honors. The effort continued. Finally, in 2,055 years after the war ended, congressional legislation awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to code talkers. The ceremony occurred in 2001, with surviving code talkers traveling to Washington, D.C. to receive America's highest civilian honor. Only a handful of the original 29 code talkers survived to attend. Most had died decades earlier, never receiving the recognition they deserved while alive. But those who did attend described the ceremony as profoundly moving vindication delayed by more than half a century but finally acknowledged. President George W. Bush, presenting the medals, stated, "In developing their code, the code talkers created the only unbroken code in the history of modern warfare. Their code was never broken, and their contribution to the war effort was instrumental in saving countless lives and bringing the war to a close." The recognition, though late, mattered. It validated what code talkers had accomplished. It introduced their story to millions who'd never heard it. It created educational opportunities. Schools began teaching about code talkers, museums created exhibits, documentaries were produced. But recognition also brought complicated feelings. Some code talkers were grateful, but questioned why it took so long. Others appreciated the honor, but remained modest, consistent with Navajo cultural values about humility and service. A few expressed frustration that recognition came primarily because their code had been militarily useful, rather than because Navajo culture itself was valuable. The code talker's story resonates beyond military history because it represents a unique inversion of power, oppression, and cultural survival. The United States government spent decades attempting to erase Native American languages, including Navajo. Boarding schools punished children for speaking their ancestral tongues. Policies explicitly aimed to replace indigenous cultures with American culture. The message was clear: your language is worthless, your culture is primitive, your identity is something to be overcome. Then, when facing an enemy that had broken every code America could devise, the government turned desperately to the very language it had tried to destroy. The worthless language became invaluable. The culture deemed primitive possessed exactly the complexity needed for unbreakable military communications. This reversal is more than historical irony. It's a profound statement about the limitations of assimilationist thinking and the resilience of suppressed cultures. The Navajo language survived attempted erasure because it was embedded in community, in relationships, in ways of understanding the world that couldn't be completely eliminated through institutional violence. Grandparents continued speaking it. Parents whispered it. Children, punished at school, spoke it during summers home. The language went underground but didn't die. When war came, that survival became military advantage. The code talkers didn't just create a code, they demonstrated that cultural diversity itself has practical value, that languages the dominant culture considers useless may possess unique properties that prove essential in unexpected contexts. For the Navajo Nation, the code talkers' legacy is complex but ultimately proud. They represent both the trauma of forced assimilation and the triumph of cultural persistence. They vindicated Navajo language at precisely the moment it was most vulnerable to permanent loss. After World War II, attitudes toward Native American languages began slowly shifting. The boarding school era gradually ended. The last federal Indian boarding school didn't close until the 1970s, but forced attendance ended earlier. Bilingual education programs emerged. Tribal language preservation efforts received some governmental support. Code talkers didn't cause this shift alone. It was part of broader civil rights movements and changing attitudes toward cultural diversity. But they provided powerful counterexamples to the narrative that indigenous languages were obstacles to progress. How could Navajo be considered worthless when it had helped win World War II? Modern Navajo language preservation efforts explicitly reference the code talkers. When advocating for Navajo language instruction in schools, for funding language revitalization programs, for respecting indigenous linguistic rights, the code talkers serve as proof that these languages have value beyond their intrinsic cultural worth. They can be strategically essential. The code talkers' story also influenced military thinking about communication security. Their success demonstrated that linguistic diversity, using languages enemies don't understand, can be as effective as mathematical encryption. Modern militaries have explored similar approaches, recruiting speakers of minority languages for sensitive communications. But perhaps the most significant legacy is educational and cultural. Code talker stories are taught in schools across America, introducing students to Native American history through a lens of contribution and achievement rather than only victimhood. Children learn that indigenous peoples weren't just passive recipients of government policies, but active participants in American history who shaped outcomes through their unique cultural resources. For young Native Americans, particularly Navajo youth, the code talkers represent something powerful, ancestors who proved that indigenous identity and American patriotism aren't contradictory, who demonstrated that traditional culture has value in modern contexts, who showed that you can serve your country without abandoning who you are. This message matters in communities where young people often face pressure to choose between indigenous identity and participation in broader American society. The Code Talkers model shows that false dichotomy can be rejected. You can be proudly Navajo and proudly American, can honor traditional culture while engaging with modernity, can speak your ancestral language, and navigate English-dominant spaces. The Code Talkers also complicate simplistic narratives about World War II. The war is often taught as the good war, morally clear, unambiguously justified, unifying the nation. The Code Talkers' story introduces necessary complexity. Yes, they served heroically, but they served a nation that had systematically oppressed their people, that hadn't granted them full citizenship rights until recently, that had tried to erase their language and culture. Their service wasn't naive patriotism. It was a calculated decision to serve despite legitimate grievances, to protect their communities and homelands, even when the nation-state claiming those lands had treated them unjustly. This complexity is more honest and ultimately more respectful than simplified hero narratives. While all Code Talkers deserve recognition, the original 29 who developed the code hold special significance. They created something unprecedented under immense pressure, knowing that failure would reflect not just on them personally, but on their entire people. Among them, Carl Gorman was one of the older recruits at 36, married with children, a skilled artist who'd attended boarding school where he'd been punished for speaking Navajo. After the war, he became a prominent artist and advocate for Code Talker recognition. He understood the historical significance of what they'd accomplished and fought to ensure the story wouldn't be forgotten. He died in 1998, having seen some recognition, but not the Congressional Gold Medal that came later. Chester Nez became perhaps the most well-known Code Talker through his advocacy and public speaking. Born in 1921, he attended boarding school where teachers hit him for speaking Navajo. During the war, he served in multiple campaigns, was wounded, and continued serving. After the war, he worked various jobs while dealing with PTSD, which he discussed openly in later years, unusual for his generation. He lived to 93, dying in 2014, having spent decades educating people about Code Talker history. Joe Kiyomiya had an experience that highlighted both the code's security and the dangers Code Talkers faced. He was captured by Japanese forces and held as a prisoner of war. Japanese interrogators, having intercepted Navajo transmissions, tried to force him to translate them. Kiyomiya genuinely couldn't, he didn't know the code, as he'd been captured before completing training. The Japanese didn't believe him and subjected him to torture, assuming he was protecting military secrets. He survived captivity and was liberated when the war ended, but his experience showed what could have happened if trained Code Talkers had been captured. Samuel Sandoval was one of the youngest original Code Talkers, enlisting at 18. He later described the contradiction of fighting for a country that hadn't fully recognized his people's rights. We weren't even allowed to vote in some states, but we could die for our country. That was the reality we lived with. After the war, he became an educator on the Navajo Nation, teaching Navajo language and culture, helping preserve the very language that had proven its value in war. The original 29 carried the weight of proving the concept. If the code failed, if it proved too slow or too inaccurate, or if Japanese forces broke it, the entire program would be cancelled and possibly never attempted again. They succeeded spectacularly, creating a foundation that hundreds of subsequent Code Talkers built upon. As the program expanded from 29 to over 400, each new Code Talker brought individual stories of why they served and what they experienced. Thomas Begay enlisted in 1943 and served through some of the war's bloodiest battles. He later described the surreal experience of being celebrated as a hero in combat, while knowing that back home, Navajo people faced discrimination and poverty. In the Pacific, commanders wanted us, needed us. Back in the States, we were just Indians. That difference was hard to process. Bill Toledo was one of 6 code talkers who worked Iwo Jima, transmitting over 800 messages in the first 48 hours of combat. He described the physical and mental exhaustion. You couldn't sleep because artillery never stopped. You couldn't eat much because your stomach was in knots. But you had to keep transmitting, keep being accurate, because Marines were depending on those messages. The responsibility was crushing. Peter MacDonald served as a code talker and later became tribal chairman of the Navajo Nation, one of the most influential Native American political leaders of the late 20th century. His experience as a code talker influenced his political career. He understood both the value of Navajo culture and the complex relationship between native nations and the federal government. His leadership helped push for code talker recognition. Not all code talkers' post-war lives followed smooth paths. Some struggled with alcoholism, a response to untreated PTSD, and the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life. Others faced ongoing economic hardship on reservations where opportunities remained limited. Some dealt with family difficulties, the strain of trauma they couldn't discuss with loved ones. But many also found meaning in their service. They'd proven to themselves and to the world that Navajo culture had value. They'd saved American lives using the language teachers had punished them for speaking. That validation, though it couldn't erase the injustices they'd faced, mattered deeply. Keith Little spoke about this years later. When I was in boarding school, they washed my mouth with soap for speaking Navajo. In the Pacific, they gave me a medal for speaking Navajo. That tells you everything about how arbitrary those boarding school policies were. Our language was never the problem. The problem was people who didn't understand its value. The last surviving code talker from the original 29, Chester Nez, died in 2014. The last code talker from World War II, Joe Vandiver Sr., died in 2021 at age 96. With their passing, the direct connection to this history ended. What remains are the stories they told, the recordings they made, the legacy they built. World War II produced countless innovations: radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons, computers. But perhaps none is more culturally significant than the Navajo Code, not because of its technical sophistication, though it was sophisticated, but because of what it represented about suppressed cultures, linguistic diversity, and the unexpected places where solutions emerge. The code talkers succeeded because they possessed something unique: fluency in a complex, unwritten language that existed outside the awareness of enemy intelligence. That uniqueness came directly from their cultural marginalization. If Navajo had been a widely spoken, well-documented language, it would have been vulnerable to cryptographic analysis. Its security derived from its isolation. This creates an uncomfortable truth. The same policies that tried to destroy Navajo language inadvertently preserved its military utility by preventing its widespread adoption. If boarding schools had succeeded, if Navajo had been eradicated and replaced with English, the language wouldn't have been available for military use in 1942. The code talkers don't owe their success to boarding schools. They succeeded despite them, drawing on language kept alive by communities that resisted cultural erasure. But the historical irony remains stark. What the code talkers definitively proved was that cultural diversity has practical value beyond moral arguments about preserving heritage. Different languages encode different ways of thinking, different frameworks for organizing information, different conceptual structures. Sometimes, those differences matter strategically. The Navajo language's complexity, its tones, its grammatical structures, its lack of written standardization made it perfect for military communications. Simpler languages wouldn't have worked as well. The very features that made it difficult were advantages in cryptographic contexts. This lesson extends beyond military communications. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources, from marginalized communities whose knowledge systems haven't been recognized by dominant cultures. When we destroy cultural diversity through forced assimilation, language suppression, educational systems that privilege one way of knowing over others, we lose potential solutions to problems we haven't even encountered yet. The code talkers served a nation that had treated their people unjustly. They did so not because that injustice was justified, but because their concept of duty, protection of homeland, and warrior tradition transcended the failures of the United States government. They served their communities, their families, their fellow Marines, and in doing so, served a country that was slowly learning to recognize their worth. Recognition came too late for most code talkers to experience it. Chester Nez, at the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in 2001, was asked how it felt to finally be honored. His response was characteristically humble and pointed. "It feels good, but it would have felt better 50 years ago." That delay reflects broader patterns of how America treats its indigenous peoples. Exploitation when useful, marginalization when not, recognition only after most have died. The code talker's story is triumphant, but it's also cautionary, a reminder that useful shouldn't be the standard by which we value cultures and languages. Navajo language has value because it's Navajo, because it carries centuries of knowledge, worldview, and identity. That it proved militarily useful is interesting historically, but shouldn't be necessary for respecting it. Today, Navajo language is endangered. Despite code talker fame, despite preservation efforts, the number of fluent speakers is declining. Young Navajo people face pressure to prioritize English for economic opportunities. The same forces that boarding schools represented pressure to assimilate, to prioritize dominant culture, continue in subtler forms. The code talker's legacy challenges this trajectory. They proved that Navajo language is worth preserving, not just culturally, but practically. They demonstrated that bilingualism is an asset, that traditional knowledge systems have modern applications, that cultural diversity makes nations stronger rather than weaker. 420 Navajo Marines created an unbreakable code. They transmitted thousands of messages under combat conditions across the Pacific. They saved countless American lives. They served with distinction in a military that didn't fully accept them, for a nation that had tried to erase their culture. They did this speaking the language their grandparents spoke, the language boarding schools punished them for speaking, the language that connected them to land, history, and identity. They were code talkers, warriors who fought with words, Marines who proved that the language the United States tried to destroy was exactly what America needed to win. Their story isn't just history, it's a reminder that the voices we silence may speak the words we'll desperately need, that the cultures we marginalize may hold solutions we can't see. That diversity, linguistic, cultural, epistemological, isn't weakness, but strength. The code talkers knew this. They carried it into war. They transmitted it in every message. And the world is different because they did.